Hello, my name is Ayala Connell and I'm a paleo and gluten-free chef, and this is an episode of Simply Paleo. And today, because it's fall in New England, which is a wonderful time of year with beautiful, beautiful colors on the leaves, we are going to make pumpkin muffins. And pumpkin is definitely symbolic of the season here in New England, and there's all different kinds of pumpkins. There's big ones, there's little ones, there's sugar pumpkins that are a little bit sweeter. There's ghost pumpkins that are whiter. There's just all kinds of funky looking pumpkins. I went last weekend with my family for our annual trip to the Picking Patch, which is a very special farm in Avon, Connecticut, where they have a hayride that takes you out to the pumpkin patch, and kids can go with their families and look for pumpkins. And the rule is always, well, only pick one you can hold because they're really quite heavy if they're quite large. But I always try to corral and herd my kids over to the largest pumpkin we can find to have everybody sit on it and have their annual family photo for Thanksgiving. So if you check out my blog at simplypaleo.com, you'll see a sneak peek of our holiday card with all these funny faces on my kids on their pumpkin. And they're just enjoying the crisp New England weather in the season. So, pumpkin muffins. Now, this recipe is very dear to my heart because it took me a very long time with a lot of trial and error, to find the perfect recipe for a paleo muffin that wasn't dry, that was moist and fragrant and lasted more than a day. It took a long time. And the other thing to consider also is the bulk of paleo baking recipes out there, they incorporate nut flours, particularly almond flour, and also coconut flour. And those are very nutritious elements and definitely part of the paleo lifestyle, a great part of the diet. But in my family, we have a lot of nut sensitivities, and in particular with my daughter, a coconut sensitivity, which is very unfortunate because as a family, we are dairy-free. And so I'm just lowering the oven here a little bit. And so that means it's a little harder because typical substitutes for dairy incorporate coconut or palm oil, which is in sort of the same coconut family as far as my daughter's sensitivities are concerned. So I really have had to work overtime in trying to find interesting recipes and help my children feel like they're able to eat all the wonderful things that are available to them. So we have a lot of muffins at home, and there's lots of different flavor profiles, and you can take this recipe and put in blueberries instead of pumpkin. You can put bits of chocolate chips and chunks of banana and make a chocolate chip banana one. You could do lemon poppy seed. There's 1,000,001 variations on a theme, but the core recipe is the same. So let's talk about pumpkin muffins and how to make them. So it's a very simple recipe. So I have my KitchenAid mixer here, which is also very dear to my heart, but you can certainly use a big bowl with a big wooden spatula and make this mix on your own. So inside the mixing bowl, I have 3/4 cup of cassava flour. Now in the paleo diet, we avoid grain, not just the gluten-free grains, or gluten grains, but also grain in general. So that means not wheat and barley and rye, but also no rice, no corn flours really, no amaranth and millet and all those ancient grains that do have nutritional properties that are beneficial, but for many of us that have chosen the paleo lifestyle, we just don't tolerate it in our gut, and we feel better when we avoid it all. So cassava flour is a wonderful grain-free flour, and this is one of the companies that I really love because it's a very good consistency and texture. But essentially, many of you are probably familiar with it, though you might not realize. Cassava is the same thing as tapioca root, and it's more sort of from the Caribbean region of the world. But tapioca starch is the starch of the cassava root, and cassava flour is the entire root flour, and it's a fantastic flour for baking paleo. Now, on its own, it wouldn't make the lovely texture of my pumpkin muffins, but when I incorporate some other elements to it, it's really the key ingredient that makes it such a star food in our household. So in addition to the 3/4 cups of cassava flour that's in here, I also have 1/3 cup of tapioca starch, which we just talked about. And then I also have 1/3 cup of arrowroot powder. Now arrowroot powder, and there's lots of different companies that make it, but Anthony's I really like because you can get this very large bulk bag. Whereas if you go to the store, sometimes you find these little itsy bitsy jars of arrowroot or these little itsy bitsy boxes, and it's not really enough to get you going very far in this type of a recipe. So Anthony's is a great company for getting bulk arrowroot. But again, it's another root, so it's grain-free. Now, sometimes with this recipe, I will replace arrowroot with potato starch. But for the case of this cooking demonstration, I'm solely using arrowroot because some people really try to avoid white potatoes because of sugar issues, insulin resistance, sugar metabolism, prediabetes, diabetes. There's lots of reasons. Or even if you're in more of that autoimmune paleo and you're trying to avoid nightshades. So arrowroot, though, in this case, it's 1/3 cup of arrowroot or 1/3 cup of potato starch. And then what I do is I put in flax meal or ground flax. Now, you can definitely buy ground flax, and there's lots of different companies that make it. What I do at home is I get whole raw flax seeds and I put them in my blender. It literally takes 20 seconds. It's so quick. And I make it into a coarse, essentially flour, a coarse meal out of the flax. And what I love about it is it's so fresh. And one of the most wonderful attributes of flax seeds is the oils that you get, the essential fatty acids that are so vital to our body and our body's health. When you buy flax meal on the shelf, it's still really good for you. There's good fats in it, there's good fiber, good protein, but it's just not quite as fresh. So I love to have it in the fridge, and it's such a quick thing. This company also makes ground flax, Spectrum. It's a fantastic company. There's other products that it makes as well that are very clean and fitting for the paleo diet. But in this case, we're talking about flax. So what I've done is taken some of the whole flax seeds, put them in my blender, made it into a flax meal or a ground flax powder. So there is a 1/2 cup of ground flax in here as well. So that is the base of my all-purpose flour mix. Those are the proportions. 3/4 cup cassava flour, 1/3 cup tapioca starch, 1/3 cup of arrowroot or potato starch, and 1/2 cup of flax meal. So in addition to that, we're going to put in some baking powder and baking soda because that helps the muffins rise and be nice and voluminous and plump. So we have 2 teaspoons of baking powder in here and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. Now, the only thing to say about this that's unique is the baking powder that I use a company called Hanes, and the reason that I use it, let me just grab it so you can see it. The thing that I love about this is it doesn't have any cornstarch in it. So many baking powders out there use cornstarch, and even some of the organic ones, the ones that are, aluminum free, but many people are sensitive to corn, and particularly cornstarch or broken down corn flours. I know for myself, I do great with whole fresh corn, corn on the cob, corn niblets, but as soon as it's been processed in any way, even an organic version, I get headaches from it. And it's very clear to me, I have a little bit of corn flour and I have headaches for like 2 weeks. It's just not worth it. I've always been black and white in that sort of way. So at any rate, Hanes has a baking powder that is made with potato starch instead of cornstarch. So I highly recommend it, and it works just the same and you get the same benefit. So in addition to that, we want to put in a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and I like to use sea salt, and particularly a fine sea salt, because it's better for you, essentially. Sea salt has so many wonderful minerals to it, and you don't have to worry about the sodium issues as well, which is great because a lot of people are concerned about that. And then lastly, the last dry ingredient is your cinnamon. So I like to put in a 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, and it is, of course, you can't smell it through the TV or the computer, but it is so fragrant. So we're going to put a 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon because these are pumpkin muffins, so you need some pumpkin spice. Now, if you really want to make it a little bit more zingier, a little bit more of a zest, you can add in a little bit of nutmeg, maybe a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, and maybe 1/8 teaspoon of allspice, and maybe a pinch of ground cloves. It'll give you a little bit more of a spicier one. You could even put a little bit of ground ginger in. But all of those really make for a nice, robust flavor that's definitely fall themed. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix up the dry ingredients in the mixer. And I just want to do it enough to incorporate the ingredients, and then we're going to do the liquid ingredients. Now, if you're doing this in a bowl, You're just going to put it in a big bowl, and then you're going to mix the liquid ingredients separately and then pour it in, just like we're going to do it in this mixing bowl. So we've got our liquid measuring bowl, and I'm going to start by putting in 2 eggs. Now, for those of you that are choosing not to eat eggs because maybe you don't tolerate them, then you can definitely use a chia seed substitute, which I do all the time. And essentially, the equivalent to 1 egg is a tablespoon of chia seeds. You can use whole or ground. And then 3 tablespoons of room temperature water. And you mix them together in a little bowl, and you just let them set aside on the counter for about 15 minutes, and it becomes gelatinous, like an egg. And if you're using 2 eggs, you just double the recipe. When you start to get over the 2 egg substitute, it doesn't work as well. But you just set it aside, and after about 15 minutes, it's nice and gelatinous. Mix it up a little bit, and then you can pour it into your liquid mixture. The other thing to say about it is when you don't use eggs in a recipe, you find that the muffin or the baked good is a little bit more dense and not quite as voluminous. So one of the things I like to do is add a little bit more baking soda to help raise it. So in this particular recipe, I used a teaspoon of baking soda. But when I avoid eggs in the recipe and I'm using the chia seed substitute, I might increase it to 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, and that helps to make that change. So we've got 2 eggs for this recipe. And I know some people have sensitivities to just the egg whites, and so you could just use the egg yolks or the egg whites, but if you find that it's a much smaller amount of liquid that you're putting in there, then you might take 2 and increase it to 3 egg yolks or 3 egg whites to have the same amount. Okay, so we've got our 2 eggs here, and then we're going to put in 1/2 cup of maple syrup. Now I like to use maple syrup, first of all, because it has that nice fall theme, but also because maple syrup has some wonderful minerals to it, so it's a very healthy sweetener. If you have blood sugar issues or diabetes, prediabetes, insulin resistance, a lot of sugar cravings, then you can either take the 1/2 cup and reduce it to 1/4 cup, or you can use stevia to sweeten it, but then keep in mind that you're shifting the proportion of liquid to dry, so you might want to put a little bit more of the other liquids in. And then the other thing to consider is that stevia, when you use it for baking in larger quantities, it definitely has a little bit of a bitter aftertaste, almost like a NutraSweet, so it tastes a little bit synthetic. So it's not my favorite sweetener, but there are other options for sure. And then the other thing is you can also just use more fruit, so you could use applesauce or mashed banana, that sort of thing. All right, so in addition, we're going to take some olive oil. Now, I am from Mediterranean descent. I was raised in Israel at a young age, so olive oil definitely runs through my veins. I say that all the time. So I always use extra virgin olive oil when I'm baking. But if you prefer a different type of flavor, which might be your preference, then you can certainly use avocado oil, which is much more benign, or a vegetable oil, but you want to make sure that it's a healthy vegetable oil. So I'm going to put in 1/2 cup of olive oil into this recipe, and I will say that it doesn't impart a very strong flavor, but again, everybody has their own preferences. So we've got the 2 eggs, we've got the 1/2 cup of maple syrup, and now I'm putting in 1/2 cup of olive oil to get the fat in there into the recipe. And then I'm going to do some milk. Now there's lots of different versions of milk. There's coconut milk, which is a great substitute and very healthy. But again, in my family, we have coconut sensitivities. So what I like to do is use hemp milk. And this is a fantastic company, Living Harvest. And they have a lot of different types of milk substitutes. But hemp milk is a wonderful substitute because it has a lot of fiber and protein and also essential fatty acids from the hemp seeds. But it also has a little bit of a thicker consistency. It's not so watery like a rice milk, for example. It has a little bit more of that milk type of consistency. So I'm going to do about 1/2 cup of hemp milk. Now, if you're not doing as much sweetener, then you can always increase the amount of milk. Okay? All right, and then the other ingredient is the vanilla, which I left over here. Sorry about that. Vanilla is great because it gives a nice flavor to the mixture. Nice added undertone of vanilla. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 2 teaspoons of vanilla. You can do a little bit less, but I really like the flavor and the smell of vanilla. It's divine. Okay. All right, so then that's the bulk of the recipe of the liquid ingredient. Now, of course, this is a pumpkin muffin, so we have to put the pumpkins in. But just to give you a sense, this is kind of the standard recipe for any type of muffin. And then if you're not going to do a pumpkin puree to add into it, then you might put in a mashed banana or a little bit of applesauce to add in a little bit more moisture if you're going to be putting in other things that are more dry ingredients to give it a different flavor profile. So as you can see, I'm just whisking this up a little bit before I add the pumpkin puree. Okay, and let's just put these things over here and get the pumpkin over. Now, you can definitely use fresh pumpkin from a pumpkin that you've cooked, but it's much more watery typically when it comes out of the cooking process. So when I bake, I like to use pureed pumpkin. And literally the can will just say pumpkin puree and the ingredients will just say pumpkin. There's other types of pumpkin mixes that have all kinds of sugars and stuff in them, so you definitely want to read the ingredients and make sure that you're getting the right type. There's a couple of times in my history that I've accidentally grabbed the wrong one and looked at it, it's like, ah, and now I don't have any pumpkin. So it's good to read. So now what I typically like to do is put about 1/2 cup of pumpkin puree into the mixture. You can put more or less, but it's a good amount. And then I'm just going to whisk this up again to give it a nice consistency. And I love it because you can see the silkiness of the pumpkin in here, and it makes for some really moist muffins and a fantastic flavor of pumpkin. All right. So now this is nice and mixed, and all of our liquid ingredients are in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pour this into the mixer with the dry. Now, I've done this a couple of different ways where I do the dry mix first, and then pour the wet in, and then do the wet in first, and then the dry. But I find that it's easier this way because I don't mess up more than one bowl. It's just easier that way. So at any rate, my mixer is here, and I'm going to turn it on low first to just incorporate it so that I don't get flour going all over the kitchen. And then once it's starting to incorporate, I'm going to put it onto a medium. And I'm just going to let it run. And in a little bit, I'm going to stop it, and I'm going to scrape down the paddle, and then I'm going to turn it on again. So we'll do that now. We're just going to lower it. Let me just move some of these things out of the way. And I'm just going to take my spatula and I'm going to scrape down some of the dry flour bits that have gotten stuck on the paddle. All right. And then we're going to raise it again and turn it on. Now, if you're using a bowl and a spatula, then it's much easier. Just but this I love because the mixer is a great way to really get an even consistency without having to work too hard. Get in here a little bit more, and it's looking wonderful. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to remove the paddle and just scrape any bits off of it because, of course, we want every bit of this batter. We don't want to lose any of it. And this makes for some nice plump pumpkin muffins, rather. Okay. So before I started this recipe, this demonstration, I preheated the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature that you want to bake these muffins at. And I also took my muffin tray and I put baking cups in them. Now you don't need to use baking cups. You can just grease the muffin tray. But I like to use baking cups because it's easier to remove them onto a cooling rack, and also it's easier to eat them. They're not all as messy. And the baking cups that I like to use, there's a wonderful company called If You Care, and they make unbleached baking cups for muffins and cupcakes. And of course I love them because they're environmentally friendly and they're unbleached, so they're a little healthier. I mean, that's for sure in line with my healthy lifestyle. But what I've also noticed is when I use these as compared to just some of those conventional baking cups out there, these don't stick as much onto the muffins. Whereas the other ones, they get so adhered that when you take the muffin out, sort of half of it is still in the cup. So these are fantastic and I highly recommend them. Okay, so what we're going to do is just make sure, so you can see the batter here, it's got lots of specks from the flax meal, but it's just a wonderful silky consistency. So what we're going to do is we're going to use an ice cream scooper, which I like to use because it's easy, but it also helps me to have kind of equal proportions. And I'm just going to use the ice cream scooper to put the batter into the muffin cups, or the baking cups rather. And don't worry about making a mess because of course none of us are perfect in putting batter into baking cups. And it comes off pretty easily when you scrape it off afterwards. So I'm just going through and I'm putting the batter in here. And this makes definitely 12 good solid muffins. You might have a little bit extra than then you find you're proportioning across the different muffins. So you don't have one that's enormous and one that's teeny weeny. But essentially I'm filling them about 3/4 full. And then what you find is that they'll raise a little bit over the paper when they're baking. Now when it goes into the 350-degree oven, I typically bake it for about 24 minutes, but I will say that every oven's a little bit different. You might have convection versus not. Convection is when the fan is blowing, so you get a little bit more of an even baking process. And so I like to use convection, but when it's not convection, it might take 25 minutes. So maybe check it at 23, but you'll know that it's ready because you can see I'm adding a little bit more because I have a little bit more batter. You know that it's ready because it's golden brown on top, and then you can take it out if that's the case and use what's called the toothpick test, where you take a toothpick, or if you have a special instrument for baking, there's like a thin long needle, and you want to put it into the center kind of tallest part of one of the muffins, and if it comes out clean and not sticky at all, then that's an indication that the muffins are well and cooked. So we're going to put this in here, and then what I'm going to do is take the muffins and I'm going to put them in the oven. It is already preheated to 350 degrees. And the rack is in the middle, and I'm going to put my timer on, which is always a good idea because without being technologically inclined, then we all forget about what we put in the oven unless you're Amelia Bedelia. For those of you who are not familiar with the children's stories, this very literal housekeeper woman who just makes a mess of everything, but the one thing she's amazing at is baking sweet treats, and they always go into the oven without her putting a timer on, and at the end she's like, oh, my muffins, and they come out looking just perfect. And it's always a very funny thing. So we're going to put the timer on, and in this case I'm familiar with this oven, so I'm going to put this on for 24 minutes, and that's my timer, which is fantastic. Now, we're not going to wait for 24 minutes on this video, so I did make some muffins in advance that I'd like you to see. So here we have pumpkin muffins, and they're wonderful, wonderfully plump and moist. And as you can see, the paper comes right off and it doesn't stick at all. So why don't we try one of these, and you can see the inside texture and how moist it is. All right, let's give it a try. So delicious. The first thing that I realize is the moisture of the muffin. It's not dry at all. But then also the wonderful flavor of the pumpkin and the cinnamon and a little bit of that vanilla and the maple. It makes for such a delicious sweet treat. But I will say that it's not overly sweet. It's not decadent sweet. It's just the perfect amount of sweetness, so you don't feel like you're overindulging, but it is so delicious. And you can see the little bits of the darker specks from the flax meal, but you don't taste any kind of crunch. So you're really getting a lot of nutrition in this muffin, and yet it's just divine. You feel like you're having a dessert, albeit not an overly sweet dessert. It's delicious. So I highly recommend that you try this muffin and get creative and try to mix it up with flavor profiles. Instead of the pumpkin puree and the cinnamon, you might put in some mashed banana and chocolate chips. You might put in some lemon juice and a little bit of lemon zest and some poppy seeds. There's so many different variations on a theme. And if you visit my blog at simplypaleo.com, there's some other muffin recipes you can find. So I highly recommend that you do that. And just to remind you, I'd love to hear from you and I'd love to get your wish list. So please, you can email me at ayeletconnell@gmail.com, or you can visit my website at simplypaleo.com and just go in right through the Contact Us page and let me know what you'd like to see cooked. Maybe you have a wish list of things that you've wanted to eat for a while but haven't been able to tolerate in your gut. Send me a line and we'll try to come up with it in a great paleo healthy way of creating the dish. So thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon at the next Simply Paleo episode.